This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Today's show is about places in Minnesota that flourished once upon a time, but now have been long abandoned. They're ghost towns. Some began with grand visions and enjoyed growing prosperity until something changed. A financial crisis, a different railroad route, the removal of native residents to reservations, even the advent of rural postal delivery changed their fate. This question came to us during the state fair.
When I was little, there was down the way some older buildings that had been abandoned. I was just so into this idea of like how old it was. The fact that there was something that somebody had put so much work into and then it was abandoned was so interesting to me. And I was never allowed to explore as much as I wanted to explore. I'm just curious what's left behind.
Thanks so much to Kiri Miller for asking this great question. She also told the Minnesota Star Tribune that she would explore an old cemetery near Hastings as a kid and came across what seemed to be abandoned barns nearby. The idea of abandoned places like this made her curious. It turns out that the place she explored as a kid was just a few miles from one of Minnesota's best-known ghost towns, Nininger. I'm here today with my colleague Anna Boone, who interviewed Kiri and wrote about some of the state's most intriguing ghost towns for Curious Minnesota. Welcome, Anna. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello.
So tell us a little bit about what you do at the Star Tribune and what drew you to take on this question for Curious Minnesota.
Yeah, I'm a digital designer here. I've been here for about 6 years, so I don't do a lot of writing. It's very one-off, but I'm excited when I get to. And I saw this question about ghost towns, and I had to answer it. I love, not that ghost towns are inherently haunted, but I love anything paranormal adjacent. So I had a lot of fun looking at this question, trying to dive into it. When I talked to Kiri, the way she described being a kid and discovering this like abandoned barn and cemetery and running around reminded me a lot of my childhood. Going to my grandma's house, she had like a huge wooded acre around her that we would just like be off searching for anything in there that could have been abandoned at one point. So
very cool. First of all, let's talk a little bit about what a ghost town is.
Yes, a ghost town is defined as a place where people used to live where they don't live anymore. So I think a lot of people, when you picture ghost town, you picture like Old West, tumbleweed rolling through, that kind of energy. But when I talked to Bill Convery at the Minnesota Historical Society, he also talked a lot about like old trading posts. The places in Minnesota don't always look like an Old West ghost town. A lot of them are just fields now. Like all the buildings have been removed. There's also like native settlements that are considered ghost towns as well. So it can look a lot of different ways. And it's kind of more rare to have like the buildings standing and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even though Kiri's question brought up so many things, at the heart of the question was how many ghost towns? So how many are there?
We don't know. Hundreds most likely. When you count everything, when you look at all the different native settlements, old trading posts, towns that were abandoned, towns that moved, a lot of towns moved, smaller towns kind of all came together into one larger place. When you count everything up, it's in the hundreds, but we don't have a definite number just because of the history of it all and how everything's always moving, coming and going.
So one of the most fascinating places that you wrote about was the ghost town of Nininger.
Yes.
And where is Nininger exactly? Or where was Nininger?
It's near Hastings. It's outside of where Hastings is now.
Gotcha.
So I drove to Nininger. I took my dog. We went on a car ride. It was about 40 minutes, I would say, from Minneapolis. There's not much there There's a township of Nininger that still exists today, but the actual ghost town of Nininger was disbanded, I believe, in 1857 or a couple of years after that. But there are historical markers. So I drove with my dog. We turned off of the highway. It's dairy farm, a different field, just a lot of farmland. And then we pulled into the driveway of like a little parking lot area. And there's like the township city hall. And they have two historical markers, one for Ignatius Donnelly, who was called the Sage of Nininger, and then one for Nininger itself, like the city, the ghost town. And it was really cool to see. It was a very windy day, so it was spooky. I also went to the cemetery that day that Kiri mentioned, that's only a couple miles from where the city of Nininger was.
So tell me a little bit about Donnelly. It sounds like he really had a vision for this place.
Yes, he did. So he started advertising the city of Nininger back in the 1850s-ish, before it was even built. He wanted to build, he called it the New York of the West. He wanted to be like the biggest city. He found a spot along the Mississippi River. He just wanted to draw in a bunch of specifically like immigrants who were coming into New York and then looking to go out further west. So they did a lot of, I found like an old ad in the New York Times. He started his own paper for Nininger when people started coming there. And it worked for a time. Like a lot of people came in and it was a thriving city. But the spot on the Mississippi was not as conducive to shipping as he thought it was going to be. It wasn't like a great spot to build a big port. So they missed a lot of the shipping that they thought they were going to get to keep building. And then there also was the Panic of 1857, which was kind of like the Great Depression, the pre-Great Depression. So it was just a huge financial crisis. The city stayed around for a couple more years before people like effectively all left. And then Donnelly stayed there until he died. So he was the last person living in the ghost town. He believed in it and he stayed with it to the end. When I talked to Bill Convery, he talked about how he really respects him for that. Like a lot of people will kind of follow things to get better. And there's people in these ghost towns who have these like dreams and they stick with it until the end. And it's kind of inspiring to see. And his house was unfortunately demolished. But to help give you like a vision of how grand he thought the New York of the West was going to be, when he built his house, Convery said that he wanted it to compare favorably to Mount Vernon. So he was kind of modeling after George Washington's house.
He was just the last resident in this big, beautiful house.
Yes, in the town. I think Convery said he was the last ghost in the ghost town of Nininger.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And then his house was around for a long time, but then they finally tore it down, I think in the 50s, you said?
Yeah, like 1950s, I think. And Donnelly stayed in Minnesota, and he also was an author. He was a politician for a long time. So he wasn't just kind of haunting. He was doing a lot of work. He stayed active long past the ghost town.
Yeah, he had that nickname, the Sage of Nininger, which is very cool. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. I also was intrigued by the ghost town of Forestville, and I have to admit some of that was because this is a town that you actually can visit because its empty buildings are still standing, and the Minnesota Historical Society maintains it. So that is on my list of Minnesota places to visit sometime. But tell me about Forestville.
Yes, Forestville is unique. It's very unique because, like you said, you can go and visit it. You can see tours. I believe a lot of the like family buildings are still up. One of the general stores is still up. It's all preserved by the Minnesota Historical Society. So you can see a ghost town in a way that you might picture it, and less in a farmland field kind of way.
Yeah, less like you have to just like imagine it in your head.
Yes. It's all pretty much there. You just have to picture the people kind of going in and out.
Got it. So what's Forestville's story? How did it get started and how did it turn into a ghost town?
It was just along a stagecoach route. So it just kind of became a town organically. It incorporated in 1854. At its peak, there were about 150 people living there. They had 2 hotels. They had 2 general stores. It was a kind of a bustling place. But the railroad bypassed it. And this is kind of a common story of when the railroad bypasses it, a lot of the wealth will move out of the city to follow the railroad, be closer to the shipping, the travel, all of it. So as people started leaving, the Meehan family, Felix and his son Thomas, they began buying up a lot of the land. So people would leave, they would buy their land. Eventually they amassed like 2,000 acres in Forestville. And they kind of turned it into a company town. So pretty much everyone who lived in the town after that point worked for the Meehans in some way. They would get paid in store credit. So they would have to come into town to use their money to keep the general store going. Although the railroad weakened it, Forestville is kind of interesting because it was the advent of the rural postal delivery that kind of dealt the town like that's when the town had the final blow because no one had to come into the town anymore to check the mail. No one was coming in to buy things because they weren't already there to check the mail since they were getting everything delivered. In 1910, the general store only made one sale, and that's when they decided to close the store, and closing the store at that point effectively ended the whole town. So it's a little different, not only because of the postal delivery, but also because it didn't have the same fate. Like it didn't just kind of disappear. Thomas Meehan had a lot of positive feelings about Forestville. It's where he grew up. It's where he was buying all this land with his dad. And so he requested that it become a state park. That was in the 1930s. I think he died in 36. So obviously it was the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of wasn't a great time to be buying land necessarily for the government or anyone. So it kind of lingered for a little bit, but eventually that wish was recognized and it became part of the state park. He donated all the land, and now all the buildings ended up being, they're still there too.
Yeah. And then it became Forestville State Park, and then they added on Mystery Cave. I have not been to the state park, but it seems like there's like not only a cave, but also a ghost town.
Yes.
Lots of reasons to go.
Yes. And I asked about that because I was curious too. I was like, so did the Meehans know about the caves, the Mystery Cave? The site manager, Matt, he said there's no indication that they did. He hasn't seen it at least, but I do think that's such an interesting pairing too, that the cave happened to be right there where the town was.
Yes. And you also asked the site manager about whether or not he'd seen any ghosts in the ghost town.
I reported the story in October, so it was a topical question at the time with Halloween coming up. He said that he did not. He laughed a little. He said that you have to be kind of open to experiencing those kind of things. And he said he does not think he's open to it, so he hasn't. Which I guess leaves some ambiguity. Maybe someone else who's open could. But he said he's been there at like all times of the night and has not experienced that.
Interesting. Well, yeah, it still leaves a little question of it, whether it might be haunted.
Yeah.
So the last town you wrote about was Old Crow Wing. And one thing I thought that was really interesting was that this turned out to be Convery's favorite, quote unquote, favorite ghost town. So
yes.
it has a really interesting story. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Old Crow Wing, it has one of the longest histories, I feel like, because it was originally a spot like a Dakota village, and then it also became an important place for the Ojibwe. And then from there, it became a spot for fur trading, and it just kind of grew organically into this multicultural hub, and it was multilingual, and he just thought that it represented like a lot of the promise of coming together. Convery said, Old Crow Wing could have been the most important city in Minnesota. It was certainly one of the most diverse. So it became a place for Dakota, Ojibwe, British fur traders. There were European Americans here pre-revolution. There were obviously people here a lot earlier than that as well.
And there's a period you wrote about where it's really growing. It was on
the Red River Trail.
Oh, gotcha.
So the ox carts would come through, kind of the ones you picture with like the two big wheels being pulled by oxen. And it was an important stop there. And it also attracted political leaders like Henry Rice and Ojibwe leader Hole in the Day.
And there's a military fort nearby.
Yes. And they chose to build it there because of Old Crow Wing, I believe, helped lead to that. They chose that site because of that.
So everything seems to be going well. Then what happens?
So the town was thriving, and then the U.S. government came in and forcibly removed the Ojibwe people. They moved them to the White Earth Reservation, and that essentially caused the town's population to be cut in half. So a lot of the town was depleted immediately due to this like mass removal of Ojibwe people. After that, the railroad goes through Brainerd instead of Crow Wing. That's kind of the final blow as well. Then a lot of the people have to move out. The city kind of falls, just like every other ghost town. It becomes less and less people who live there. People have to follow where the money's going, and the money's following the railroad for the most part.
Gotcha. And this town is also part of a state park.
Yes, there's a hiking trail that Convery talks about that's like a really good loop. You can see a house. There's a white house that I believe is part of Old Crow Wing, the ghost town. It's the only building left standing, but there's a lot that you can do to walk around the area, and you get the history. I believe they tell the history of it. He mentioned like throughout on different plaques throughout this beautiful hike there, which I haven't been to, but I'm really excited to go. It's on our list for the summer, that and Forestville.
I love that. And it is Crow Wing State Park?
Yes.
Cool. So after going deep on all these places and thinking about ghost towns, what do you think it is about these failed places that make them so compelling to us?
I think that you go to these places and you imagine how they used to look, and it makes you think kind of critically about where you're living now and if that will ever be the fate of where you live. I talked with Convery a little bit about this, where ghost towns sound like such an old phenomena. It doesn't sound like something that could happen today necessarily, but he kind of said it absolutely could happen today, which really makes you think. And yeah, I think just anytime you see the past, it kind of makes you confront the present a little more critically.
Yeah. Think about, I know there are places that are growing and places that are shrinking in Minnesota all of the time, and different factors that are affecting that. So that's super interesting.
Definitely. There was a comment on the story that said, it's interesting how the rural postal delivery was kind of what killed Forestville, when now we all have like Amazon. We're getting stuff shipped at kind of unprecedented rates directly to us. No one's really going to a hub. I thought that was really interesting. Almost less of a town dissipating and more like everywhere is kind of a tiny town in its own way. Like, yeah, I thought that was an interesting comment.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And it's so interesting also to look back, and then you can see these different turning points where the town's trajectory was going up, and then the railroad made a decision and suddenly everything changes. So
yes, absolutely.
Okay, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send a note to curious@startribune.com. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.